Emotional and social intelligence.
Right, emotional and social intelligence,
Yep.
which I think, I'm sure you guys will all find fascinating and very relevant to your personal as well as professional lives. As Agnes mentioned, the two of you together founded Intentional Insights, and if you wish to kind of elaborate on what that is, feel free to do that.
Sure.
And then he is also an assistant professor, correct, at Ohio State University. So we're so pleased to have him with us tonight. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. I think you made the good decision. All right. I'm glad that we're a small, intimate group. I don't have to use the mic, so that's always good. So I want to start the presentation with talking about decision making. You know, we're going to be talking about helping clients avoid disaster. But before we talk about clients, I want to talk about ourselves and something that's different from work. Just want to talk a little bit about driving. Now, how many of you consider yourself below average drivers, like 45% category, 45% and below? Raise your hand. Honesty, I like it. What about average drivers? 45 to 55%. And okay, cool. So we have about half of the people here. We have 2 people who consider themselves below average. We have 3 or 4 people who consider themselves above average, and we have about 6 people who are in the 55% category and above.
Their perception.
That's great. Well, how many people in the United States do you think consider themselves above average drivers? Just raise your hand, call out.
Everyone's above average. I think I read it's like 80% or something ridiculous like that.
Something like 93%, actually.
Really?
Yes, 93% of Americans. So you guys are better than most. You guys are better than most. 93% of Americans consider themselves above average. And Americans are actually worse at this than people in other countries. Now, in Sweden, about 69% of people consider themselves above average. Still bad, but not nearly as bad as the United States. So, and how many people do you think, when they say, I'm 99% confident on this, how many times, what's the percentage that of times that they're actually correct?
2%.
Ooh, that's pessimistic.
Confident?
If you say, I'm 99% sure.
Of anything.
50-50.
80% of times they're right. So 1 out of 5 times, 4 out of 5 times they're right. Now think about how much money Las Vegas makes in this difference between people's perceptions and how many times they're actually right.
Yeah.
Now, how many times have you heard, be confident, believe in yourself, take your dreams?
You can do it.
You can do it. Well, there's a problem in our society. There's a problem in our brains. It's called overconfidence bias. And this is one of the many, many biases, cognitive biases, thinking errors that our mind suffers from. So overconfidence bias has been shown to really undermine our decisions in all areas of life. We tend to be way too confident for our own good. Like I said, the average person, when she or he says they're 99% confident, they're actually 80% confident. So it's a really bad ratio. People tend to be really overconfident, and this is highly problematic. I'll give you an example in a way it may not seem intuitive. So I was doing some consulting for a mid-sized nonprofit here in Columbus. And as part of that, I was doing some executive coaching for the head of the nonprofit, the executive director. Now, the executive director, he was having a lot of anxiety because the board was really pressing on him and pushing him and trying to get him. They were trying to get him to do stuff, fundraising, and they were being really mean about it, like really nasty, treating him harshly. And he was getting burned out, and he was feeling really anxious. And I told him, hey, you really need to go to the board. You need to talk to them about this. This is not good for you. This is not good for the organization. And he wouldn't. He just wouldn't. He said, no. If the board hear about me, they'll perceive me as weak, and they'll fire me. they'll fire me on the spot. That's what he was telling me. And I was like, no, they wouldn't. What kind of a board would do that? Come on. So I was giving him executive coaching. Eventually, he went to the board. And the board were very supportive. They're like, what? We didn't know our words were causing you to feel this way. We're sorry. We're going to support you. We're going to be really supportive for you. But you know what? It was too late. He was already burned out. And within a few months, he tendered his resignation. So now the nonprofit is doing a pretty expensive executive director search. And he's looking for a new job because he couldn't stay there. He was just really triggered. And you know what? This is a combination of two biases. One is the confidence bias, overconfidence, and one is the pessimism bias. So overconfidence can be associated with both optimism and pessimism. You can be optimistic and overconfident, and you can be pessimistic and overconfident. He was overconfident in his pessimism. He was overconfident that he would have a negative outcome from the board. So overconfidence isn't simply associated with optimism, which is a mistake that people often tend to make when thinking about confidence and overconfidence. They tend to associate it with optimism, but it's also associated with pessimism. So people can be overconfident and optimistic and overconfident and pessimistic. And so that's really important to remember. These are typical errors that people make that really harm organizations. When I go into organizations, I see both of these things, and they both need to be addressed. Now, the best combination with overconfidence is to calibrate the extent of your overconfidence. How overconfident do you tend to be? We'll talk about how to do that. But basically, for just right now, briefly, what you want to do is figure out how overconfident, if you tend to always be consistently late for a meeting by 10 minutes, that should give you some data on how confident you tend to be in your speed of your arrival on time to a meeting. And that should give you an ability to correct for that. Yes, exactly. So that's a way of correcting it. So this is just a very brief kind of intuitive correction. But that's overconfidence, pessimism, and optimism. Now, I want to share a story that has to do with the other aspect of overconfidence. That's a little bit about me. So, where are you from? Now, that's a question. Imagine if you go to a deli, or you go to a restaurant, or you go to a grocery, and you're checking out in the cash, and you say hello to the cashier, and the cashier says, "Where are you from?" Or you go to the restaurant, and the waitress says, "Where are you from?" Radha knows this. How would you feel? Feel alienated? You feel disheartened? You feel isolated and rejected? That's kind of my experience pretty often. When I get asked that question pretty often. And it's a lot of people with my background, with my accent, and similar people who aren't from around here often get that sort of question. Now, I came here when I was 10, when my parents brought me here from the former Soviet Union, from this little country called Moldova. That's where I'm from, if you're curious.
I thought it was Texas.
By way of Texas. And they got me to New York City, and I grew up in a pretty situation of poverty. My mom cleaned people's houses. My dad drove a bread truck, so we never lacked for bread, which fell off the back of a truck. So in that kind of context, I was growing up. I was surrounded by friends who were mainly from Russia, kind of Russian immigrants, and I was in that circle. Now, people who were outside of that circle made fun of me, and I had kind of bullies beat me up for my accent. But in that sort of environment, I was thinking about whether I should drop my accent or not drop my accent, change my accent or not change my accent. I decided I wanted to retain it as part of my cultural heritage. And I thought it wouldn't cost me much. It would just be my accent, and I'd be part of my community with Russian people. Well, it turned out to be pretty costly. I was overconfident about how the lack of costs of that decision, because once I moved out of New York. Now, New York is a cultural hodgepodge. Not a big deal if you have a Russian-American background there. Once I moved out and I started living in North Carolina and then Ohio, that's when it became a big deal. That's when it became a problem. So I didn't think about that. I didn't think about the long-term consequences. And I didn't think about the research on overconfidence and about the research on foreign accents. It actually turns out that if you have a foreign accent, you're statistically less likely to get a job. You're statistically less likely to be trusted by people if you have a foreign accent. Here, the psychologist in the room is nodding. Yes, that's what the research shows. I didn't know that when I was deciding on whether to keep my accent or not. So I was really overconfident, and I made the bad decision, one which I'm still paying for, that people trust me less and people are less likely to work with me, collaborate with me, just because of the accent. That's all. Now, the only silver lining is that I'm a public figure. I go on radio shows and TV and podcasts, and there's a distinction that's given by my accent. So at least I have a silver lining. Most people in organizations where you do consulting aren't going to have that benefit. So you need to keep that in mind about what people tend to be overconfident about and what kind of decisions they tend to make, not thinking about their long-term ramifications. So now I'm going to talk about the presentation as a whole, just so you know what you're going to be taking away from it, what the structure is. First, I'll talk about what I hope you'll take away from the presentation. Then I will ask you to choose a decision that you'll be thinking about and make through the process of decision making, one that you're thinking about or that your clients are thinking about, so that you'll use it as something that you'll practice with. Then we'll talk about avoiding disastrous decisions. I'll do the presentation, some Q&A, avoiding disasters after a decision was made. That's a separate activity. So first is avoiding disastrous decisions, and second, avoiding disasters once a decision is made. And then we'll have a group discussion as part of that. And then we'll have a final Q&A. And I'll talk about tip sheets that you can get for free if you wish. So let's talk about the takeaways that I hope you will get. First, our emotions are central to decision-making. Decision-making is typically seen as something of a cold, rational field. It's really not. Research shows that our emotions are fundamentally important in decision-making, and we should really consider them and be aware of our emotions. We should be emotionally intelligent about ourselves and how we feel and why we feel this way to make the right decisions. And we should also be aware of how and when our emotions may steer us awry. That's crucial to remember. We must master our own problematic mental patterns, and that's cognitive biases. We need to be aware of our own cognitive biases. How overconfident are we? How good of a driver are we, really? How likely are we when we say we're 99% sure that the thing is going to happen? Or if we're 80% sure, what is the actual probability? So these are things that we need to think about. And finally, effective decision-making tools combine intuitive and analytical thinking modes. So not simply analytical, as I said, not simply cold and rational, but also intuitive, kind of considering both and combining them in a holistic, synergistic whole. Now, this is not going to be a lecture simply by a professor. I'm a practitioner of this stuff. I go and I do consulting for companies, for nonprofits, and so rather than just say that, I want my clients to talk for me. So here's a testimonial I had from a presentation from Teresa Trost, who is an executive director of Community of Mid-Shares in Mid-Ohio, after a presentation much like this one. I will never approach decision-making the same way again. You gave me some wonderful insights on cognitive biases and how they influence our decisions. I plan to use your pre-mortem process with my team and our board, and we'll talk about the pre-mortem process in the later part of the presentation. And this is a consulting testimonial from someone some of you may know. So Mark Madsen, VP of Human Resources at EWI, he's prominent in the local area here. So talked about how I helped him motivate scientific people who work at EWI to sell themselves to engage in that field. Now, let's talk about another cognitive bias, empathy gap. Now, empathy gap refers to us underestimating the intensity of feelings among other people. We underestimate the intensity of their feelings and the significance of their feelings to them, and we tend to assume that other people feel the same way that we do. And there's a kind of projection going on, but it's really about underestimating how important other people's feelings are to them. And I'll talk about the example that I had with EWI as what went on here. So EWI had trouble motivating its scientific personnel to sell themselves. EWI has about 200 staff, about 150 of them are engineers, hard science engineers, people who do welding, stuff like that. And one of their goals was to get these people to sell the products of the company, to sell the services. What EWI does is provide consulting for companies. So they solve problems for other hard science companies, for other companies that do welding, and they need some problem solved, and they go to EWI. In order for that to happen, it needs to be known as a source of credibility and expertise in the market. And in order for that to happen, its engineers need to do white papers and thought leadership papers and presentations. And its engineers weren't doing that. And they were just like, why aren't the engineers doing that? Let's give our engineers some training on how to do that. And they gave them training, and they still weren't doing that. And they were like, well, what's going on? Why aren't our engineers doing that? Well, are they lazy? Are they incompetent? And so Mark and I talked, and he brought me in as someone who can help diagnose the situation. And it turned out that the engineers simply weren't really motivated to sell themselves. They are really engaged with their work. They're technical people. That's what they think about. They think about their problems. And they don't like marketing. They don't like selling. And I told that to Mark, and Mark said in so many words, what, our engineers have emotions? I mean, he was semi-joking, obviously, but really, I mean, you remember that, the previous presentation? Agnes knows. You remember Mark was at the previous presentation I did. What did he say?
Yeah, he was there and he agreed. It's just not intuitive, I guess. They're just like, no, like, oh, you're a scientist or you're a computer programmer. It's just a common myth that some people are free of emotions just because of their jobs.
It's a myth. And just because engineers don't show emotions doesn't mean that they don't have emotions. And so this is an example of empathy gap and how it takes place in companies. Companies tend to assume often that their personnel are robots. And they don't consider the emotions of their personnel and how to get their personnel emotionally engaged with what they need to do if those personnel are not already engaged, as engineers aren't engaged with selling. So we changed the conversation. We changed how we talk to them. Instead of talking about branding and selling, I talked about getting engineers to be engaged with getting reputation among their peers and being thought leaders in their fields. Now, engineers are emotionally motivated with being thought leaders. They are emotionally motivated by being seen positively among their peers and having social reputation among their cohort. That was really important to them. And after that, they got much more engaged, and they did many more presentations and thought leadership papers. And it all came about from changing the way that the company tried to encourage and motivate its engineers to talk to its people. The communication to internal stakeholders was lacking. And that was a crucial problem here. That was the fundamental issue. And it didn't cost the company anything. It didn't cost the company anything to change it except changing its mindset, except changing the language. From branding and selling to thought leadership, reputation, peer engagement. And that's all. And people were motivated. It's all about reframing the conversation. So in order to do that, what happened? Diagnosing the problem, recognizing the sympathy gap, and then addressing the empathy gap. Now, there's an easy way to address empathy gap in general, and I'm going to practice an exercise right now here with all of you that I often help companies in which I do consulting to engage with. If I see that there's an empathy gap, I use this exercise to build up their empathy and compassion with each other. Now, empathy refers to understanding of other people's emotions. Compassion refers to caring about other people's emotions. So just to make sure that we're using the right terms. And this is an exercise that I'm going to offer you the opportunity to engage in this exercise. You don't have to do it as in all sorts of activities. Now, This is an exercise that I have some trouble with when I do presentations in the South here and in the UK because of formal norms of formality. So I anticipate there will not be as many problems here. I don't find too many problems in Columbus. So what I would like you to do is turn to the person next to you, whoever that person happens to be. Hold that person's hands. Look into their eyes.
Actually, personal here.
There you go.
We're gonna do it right.
Okay. And tell that person, I care about you as one person at a time. One person at a time. And then change 3 times. I care about you as a human being. And I care about everything do you want to join, Agnes? Yes. Yes. So let's make sure there's 2. Yes. So say, I care about you as a human being, and I wish the best to all of you and your loved ones. Just say that 3 times and then change. The other person says the same thing.
Okay, so one person says it 3 times.
Yep.
I care about you, and I wish all the best to you and your loved ones. I care about you, and I wish all the best to you.
I wish and care for you and all of your loved ones.
I care about you.
I really care about you.
Right.
And I care for us.
Yes. Sean Bless, you should bring Gold Stars to the lab.
I'm telling you.
I keep telling my therapist the same thing.
Oh, it's hard not to care.
Virtual star.
Are we recorded for eternity?
We're gonna.
That's a big
So I'd like to hear about your experiences with this exercise.
I'm sorry.
I'd like to hear about your experiences.
I noticed the first sentence was kind of like a trial sentence of just saying it, but it seemed to deepen every single time that I did it. Next time there was kind of a resonance that occurred. So the message kind of became more powerful as it went forward.
Yeah. Great.
Kind of along those lines, I almost felt like we relaxed more into each other, right? The more we said it, and you just really felt each other as a human.
I noticed that I slowed my pace of speaking because I wanted it to be meaningful to him. And sometimes I have a rapid delivery that isn't as caring, I guess.
Yeah. That's great.
I always experience your caring, Judy. Thank you.
I looked in your life partner's eyes.
That's great.
And then I forgot we were supposed to do it 3 times. I wasn't sure why we kept repeating ourselves.
No worries.
It's just so authentic, right?
That's very authentic. Anybody else care to
Well,
share?
the first time you say it, you're just kind of like throwing it out there. You're not comfortable with it. You're really not sure what you're saying. But by the time you said it the 3rd time, you actually felt and meant the words that you were saying.
Yeah. Now imagine if every meeting in every company that you engaged with started with this 2-minute exercise. 2 minutes. How much better would that meeting go? How much better would it go if this 2-minute exercise was the start of every meeting at every company, especially around contentious issues?
I'm trying to get an image of the people I work with.
Yeah. So you don't need to do the hand holding if that would be uncomfortable in your company. You can just look into each other's eyes and say that. And if there are some, gender norms or kind of, sexual harassment stuff, it depends on the company. It depends on the context. But I try to introduce this, and some companies, like I said, in the UK and in the US South have more problems with this sort of exercise. And generally, I don't tend to find too many problems here in the Columbus area, along the coasts. But your mileage may vary. It depends on the company. It depends on the culture. But yes, you can just do the eyes. But I tend to recommend the hands, and this is why. The more senses you get engaged, according to the research, the more impact you have. So here you get a number of senses engaged when you do the hands. You get kinetic learning. You get, touch, which is one aspect, and then you get different aspects of learning engaged. You'd get kinetic learning engaged if you do touching. If you do sight, that's obviously visual learning, and also the sense of sight. And auditory, you hear. And textual, you say. So different sorts of learning. You get, yes?
It felt a little rote to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I love Peggy,
Mm-hmm.
but the sound of my voice repetitive. It wasn't my voice. It was
Mhm.
your words.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get that reaction?
Only with people who are very cold-hearted.
So actually,
He knows you.
so I'm going to comment on that because
I'd rather say my words.
Yeah.
so
When I, to her eyes, I want to say my words.
that's scary. Peggy, you might want to move at this point. No, but I love what you said because I think I changed mine just slightly to make it fit like me, and it worked well.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it became So it was just a great way to get it
Sure.
started.
Yeah,
So absolutely agree.
But seriously, it does. It's something that sometimes it helps people to put it in their words. Sometimes it causes them to feel uncomfortable. So I always have to calibrate this exercise. So if I have worked with a group for a while, I ask them to put it in their words. But if I'm just working with a group for the first time, if I feel that a group is not ready in terms of formality, I don't ask them to hold their hands. So I have to choose each time what I do with a group. I felt that this group was ready to hold hands, but some groups I would not ask them to hold hands. So it really does depend. There you go. Yes, sir.
It seems possible to derive similar benefits unilaterally. That is, I could be sitting at my desk, and if I observe a coworker pass by,
Mm-hmm.
I can mindfully take a moment
Mm-hmm.
and say, may that person be happy and be well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So there is a next. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so that mindfulness meditation,
Mhm.
And perhaps in a business meeting, that might be a beginning point, is we just take a minute just to think
Mm-hmm.
these thoughts. But I practice this
Excellent.
at work and have shared it with others, and it is that simple,
Mhm.
of simply turning the attention, turning the heart, and just wishing another person well.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's known as the loving kindness meditation
Yeah, it's a
in
Zen
Zen Buddhism. Yes, and it's something that I also make a decision about whether to bring up or not, depending kind of on the group and how I feel about the group.
But you can leave the Zen part out of it.
Right.
You don't
Yes.
need Zen.
Um,
Do that.
Yeah. So it's something that I found that most companies tend to be resistant to this sort of thing that is not feel spiritual. You have to really sell them on the meditation part of it. And so when I do a presentation that specifically focuses on meditation, I don't do too many of those, but I talk about the loving kindness as one sort of meditation you do. But I find that you have to do a lot of kind of, leading them up to this point where they're in a space where they're comfortable. In other words, that's an advanced skill. So what you're talking about, kind of, turning your mind and telling others loving kindness, that's an advanced skill that you have to build up your skill at other things. Whereas this exercise, the one that I just did, is super simple to implement and is very powerful, very effective. And it's effective. Go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
Yeah, so it's effective because because it engages a lot of your senses and a lot of learning styles, which are really powerful things in order to get people engaged and get them to be empathetic and compassionate toward each other. It really helps avoid disasters, which is kind of one of the points that we're talking about, through improving company culture. A toxic company culture. Right now, I'm being brought on to help address a nonprofit which has a toxic company culture, and I definitely plan to do this exercise as part of my activities there, because any company that has toxic culture, this really helps address that and helps people remember they're human beings and other people that they're working with are also human beings.
When you introduce it, is it early on in the process, like
Yeah.
you did with us tonight?
Yes. Yep. I introduce it early on before I do activities that are likely to result in tensions.
I was going to say, I love it because to me it comes down to, you say intentional insight, right? It's your intention.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost like helps you let go of what you came in with
Mm-hmm.
and helps you connect on a very basic level. Oftentimes in conflict, people want the same thing, they're just coming from a very different perspective, or they're fearful, or something
Yeah.
else is going on, and this really helps level set. I'm not saying it cures everything, but it
Mm-hmm.
just takes that edge off.
Yes.
And people could just really just be themselves, be human together,
Mm-hmm.
versus coming into fight, you know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
with their own idea of what should happen.
Yes,
So-
and this relates to the very basic idea of emotions,
Yeah.
that emotions are much more important than we intuitively give them credit for. This empathy gap. We forget the strength of feelings in other people, we forget the strength of feelings in ourselves, and this exercise takes us to a better place emotionally and helps us make better decisions in business contexts.
I think on some level, whether it's subconscious or conscious, like with Eric, I think people are feeling good feelings about other folks, but it was wonderful to have the permission to be directly, to directly be able to communicate that to someone. It was just very nice.
Even when it's really difficult, right?
Hey, I'm telling you, from my experience, even people who are somewhat hostile to each other, who have different goals and conflicts in meetings, that brings them closer together and helps them kind of like, well, after you tell each other that you care about them as a human being and you care about their loved ones, right? Like,
Well, I like the-
What happens if they really don't? I mean, a lot of, I've been in a lot of companies where executives, they hate each other.
Mhm.
VP of marketing, sales, et cetera.
right, so this helps change the atmosphere in a room, and it helps shift this atmosphere. So even if, they kind of leave behind a little bit of the hate, and they come into a better place to connect with each other, if they say that we're all human beings. Even if we hate each other, we share much more in common than we disagree on. I mean, if we are super bitter rivals, I mean, I have not worked in that sort of atmosphere. If they're like really, really, really hate each other and can't stand each other's guts, but they're not likely to be in a meeting together if they're that bad. So, I hear you.
I think I just described every C-suite I've been in.
There you go.
Was there a question?
Oh yeah, I like the shifting of positioning rather than kind of a me versus the other person for potential conflict. It's kind of both of us versus a common conflict. So there's kind of a shifting vectors and kind of teaming up when you do an exercise like this. But
Yeah.
I can also see that empathic miss, that people aren't ready to do that kind of activity. That could be really difficult. That may feel superficial and may not address some of the core causes.
I mean, it's not going to address the core causes, but a bandage is better than nothing. A bandage on a wound is better than no bandage, right? So it still helps the meeting flow better. That's what I find. And it helps the meeting flow better. We also tend to think of ourselves as really rational. So this is who we tend to think we are. We think we are this head, the brain. Whereas what we really are is this. We are a little gray mind guy on a beautiful, colorful elephant of emotions. That's what the research shows. Most of our decision making is shaped by our emotions, by how we feel. And the research describes this as system 1, the elephant system, or the autopilot system. So the autopilot is what I'll use. And system 2, which is the intentional system. Now, the autopilot system, that's, if anyone wants to read about this, a really good book is Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And this system, the autopilot system, is subconscious, automatic. It's habitual. It's our instincts. It's our gut reactions. It's our intuitions. It's how we feel. It's what we react. It's what we want to do. And so when we did the empathetic thing, we were speaking the language of the autopilot system. We're speaking to each other's emotions. We're getting each other on the same emotional wavelength, which helps people make much better decisions and work together in teams, builds up trust. The other system, system 2, is the intentional system. Now, the intentional system is more conscious, mindful, attention. It's the mathematical system. It's the logical system. It plans things. It goes ahead. It can catch when our emotions lead us astray, for example, with overconfidence, optimism and pessimism bias, and empathy gap, and correct those. But it's much weaker. It reacts much slower. So the autopilot system reacts in milliseconds. It's a system that evolved in the savannah to take us out of the way of a saber-toothed tiger. So it's the fight or flight response. So we survived because our ancestors had that system and it worked really well. But it's not the system that we need to survive in this modern world. We need the intentional system. And this system actually arose, what the current research shows, when we started living in tribes. Because, when you're getting constructive criticism from your boss, the autopilot response is to kind of, just shut your ears and say, la, 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 I can't hear you. That's the defensive response, the flight response. Or the fight response is to yell back at your boss and say, no, you're wrong. That's completely not me. That's the aggressive response. The intentional response is to say, okay, let me take some notes on this and incorporate this into my performance next year. Before my next performance. Now, how hard is that to take constructive feedback well? That's a trained response. That's not our automatic response. So that's an example of the intentional system at work. And you can feel how difficult it is to deal with constructive feedback. That's when you're using your intentional system. So we were speaking, that exercise, that was speaking to each other's autopilots. That wasn't on a very intentional level. And it's very important to get our autopilot system in alignment with our intentional system to make good decisions. So it's the intuitive, analytical combining together. There was a question.
With empathy being understanding, I think of understanding as head and somewhat conscious and mindful. So I guess I don't fully understand why empathy isn't also considered on the intentional.
Empathy can be intentional. It depends on how it works for you. So some people come to empathy from an intellectual perspective.
Yeah.
Some people, when they see someone crying, they go like, oh no, I must help you. That's empathy, that you understand how that person feels intuitively and you want to help, compassion. That can be very intuitive, and that's the emotional system, that's the autopilot. Now, somebody can also go and see, that person's crying. Should I do something? Maybe that person wants to be left alone. Maybe I shouldn't go and bother and disturb that person, even though I'm pulled to help that person. That person may be, they just may need time alone or something like that. They may intellectualize it, and they may come to that place from a perspective of thinking about the situation and trying to figure out how that person feels. So basically empathy can be in both systems.
That helps. When I think of when I'm intentionally empathic, I'm listening for emotions. I'm mindful that there's emotions in the situation. I'm listening for what those are, and I want to see if I can reflect what those emotions are. So I feel like in my case, it falls more on the intentional side.
That's totally understandable. And there are definitely people who are like that. I'm more like that also. I tend to be more analytical in my thinking, and the empathy doesn't come intuitively to me. There are other people who are much more warm. People who are like you and I are usually described as cold. Doesn't mean cold is bad. It just means that it comes from an intellectual perspective and kind of having to think about it. And other people are much more like, oh, I must dive into the situation and address the problem that someone is experiencing. They're much more intuitively want to help and address the problem. And they can immediately sense the emotions that other people are experiencing. Sometimes to their detriment. I know a lot of people who are excessively empathetic and who feel other people's emotions in the room. I think Rada is probably one of those people. So being able to feel, if anyone in the room has a certain level of discomfort, it makes a person who's empathetic really uncomfortable that person has discomfort. I don't know if that resonates with your experience in any way. Yeah. So, I don't have that. I'm like, oh, that person's uncomfortable. Oh, well. So, is it within my goal set to make that person comfortable? No, then okay. No, so I am come to it from a much more intellectual perspective. So that's a difference.
Thank you for making me feel comfortable with that question. So thank you for making me feel comfortable with that question.
Excellent.
And I love that it's not a good or bad thing. It's just understanding how both can be leveraged in a more productive way, right? To
Absolutely.
help you with whatever you're trying to achieve. So,
Absolutely, yeah. There's no good or bad. It's just a thing that's about somebody's personality.
Yeah.
So, dealing with cognitive biases. We want to put numbers on it. This is the best way of dealing with cognitive biases, by calibrating your intuitions and seeing where you are and figuring out where your mind is likely to steer you wrong and putting numbers on the situation. Now, if this was a half-day workshop, I'd go really deeply into how to put numbers on it. But to give you a sense of it, I gave you the example with if you're late to something and how to put numbers on it. You can do that with any sort of decision. If, let's say, you perceive an empathy gap, consider, whether when someone has feelings about a situation, think about what's the intensity of their feelings on a scale of 1 to 10. Just estimate, guess your reaction. And then ask them what their feeling is about the issue on a scale of 1 to 10. That's a very easy way to address empathy gap. If you think a situation is likely to turn out well, estimate how likely you think it is going to be turned out well, and then see whether you're right or wrong. Or if it's going to turn out badly, see how likely it is to turn out badly. Estimate, put your probability of it turning out badly, and then see if it does turn out badly. Over time, that will help you calibrate for the bias of whether it's optimism or pessimism and the overconfidence aspects of it. So all of these things, a lot of these biases, and there are lots more. So I encourage you to go on the Wikipedia list of cognitive biases and check that out. That has a list of over 100 biases. I don't always recommend Wikipedia as a professor, but in this case, there are good people working on this specific article on Wikipedia who are working on it thoroughly. So there's a list of over 100 biases. And most of them can be addressed through this sort of numerical calculation and calibration. You put numbers on your current experience, on your estimates, and then if it's about the other person, ask them what their experience is. If it's about you and your predictions about a situation, see how it turns out. And that way you can calibrate yourself over time. Now, this is not something I will go into, but there's a web app that was created based on my work on putting numbers on significant decisions. Again, if this was a longer presentation, I would go into it. But I don't have time for it for this presentation. But I gave it to you specifically on your handouts so that you can check it out. And one of the tip sheets that you can get is specifically informed by this web app. So it's meant to go together with this web app. All right. Now, I also want to talk about, once you make a decision, how do you prevent a disaster? How do you prevent failure in a project? We, unfortunately, in our companies, in our consulting with our clients, we don't often think about prevention of disasters. There's a lot of glory in crisis management. When a leader comes in and she's a turnaround leader and she comes into a corporation and she saves it, that's great. Get a lot of glory, get a lot of heroism. But what about the leader who prevented the crisis in the first place? What about that leader? How much glory does that person get? Nothing. Not really. And it's very unfortunate, but that's the way our society remunerates its leaders. So it's a big problem. Now, we want to actually help our clients avoid disaster, not save them from disaster in the middle of disasters. I'm not a crisis manager. I'm a crisis preventer. I help people avoid the disasters. An ounce of prevention is worth many, many pounds of cure, as Ben Franklin said. Yes?
Gleb, a word that you haven't really defined for me and that I'm struggling with a little bit is the word disaster.
Mm-hmm. Any sort of bad situation that you don't want to have.
I reserve that for really, really big and bad things.
Okay.
And but you had mentioned earlier that the power of vocabulary and words and so on.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Business experience, my everyday, it's not the disasters that I'm trying to prevent. It's really many, 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 many much smaller things. It's the little hurts and insults and gigs and slight misunderstandings, that those are the things that, to me, in my experience, are much more in everyday life. I've experienced, thank God, very few disasters. Even when very bad things have happened in the workplace, such as running a call center, for example, I did one time, and the switch goes down. That's about the worst situation. No calls are coming in, agents are on the phone, but yet we're still paying them. Customers are trying to get a call through, and they can't reach anyone. And yet, that was just a thing that needed to be fixed. No one called it a disaster.
Sure, but how many people are going to get to come to a presentation called Avoid Misunderstandings? But seriously, I understand what you mean. And disasters...
I am serious.
Yes, so I understand that. So I'm much more comfortable with saying everyday disasters, and saying being late to a meeting for me is an everyday disaster. So I'm much more comfortable with this term. I understand that some people may not be. So this is just a matter of terminology. And, some people, when you say few, mean 3, and some people, when you say few, mean 15. So this is kind of one of those vague terms that I'm comfortable using because of the emotional resonance. I think the emotional resonance here is important. For me, being late is a small everyday disaster that I want to avoid, or something like that. Or insulting someone unintentionally in an email, someone becoming offended by something I said.
So like you said then, the definition for these purposes really is avoiding something that you don't want to happen.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Okay.
Making a decision that doesn't help you reach your goals.
Okay.
Making a bad decision.
I guess I felt the same way when I felt like disaster, because that's kind of my background. And I thought, when I thought of preventing disasters, is that most disasters happen because of the small things. Like the BP, I don't know if you've ever studied BP, but if you went back and looked at all the notes on that, it was, the guy who worked a 16-hour shift, it was the valve that was checked and noted that it was wrong. It was, there were multiple things that weren't disasters, but they were these small events that kept taking place that no one was listening or reacting to.
Yeah.
And all of those things led to disaster. So had someone taken the time to take care of those little things, the sleight of hand, the misunderstanding, the not paying attention to those small things, they would have prevented the disaster. That's
Absolutely.
That's how I interpreted that.
Yeah, and when you think of, all the little times that the executive director was caused to be anxious by the actions of the board, each of those little times, individually was not that much. Altogether, it ended up in a disaster for both the executive director and the nonprofit. And, with EWI, it was leading to a disaster. I mean, they're still right now in a state of kind of restructuring, and they had to let a number of people go because while their sales are picking up because of the conference, they didn't have the volume of sales they had before. They would have had if they had talked to their engineers correctly in the first place. So this is an example of little things leading to bigger things. Yes?
I'm sitting here, and my context is my prior life in the corporate world, doing 9 mergers and acquisitions. And at least half of those should never have been done.
Yep.
And those turned into disasters because
Absolutely.
people were making sometimes over-emotional decisions.
Yep.
Or greed, pride, all those kinds of reasons.
I totally agree. This app helps evaluate whether you're making a good decision on any sort of question, like merger, like moving headquarters, like hiring an employee, like rolling out a product, so sort of things like that.
Thank you. That's a good context for the organizational lens.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm focusing on the organizational lens here. And what you want to do if you do decide on a merger. So preventing a disaster, I'm right now working with a nonprofit that is doing a merger. And they are bringing me in to do this process, which is called a premortem. And the premortem is a way of avoiding a disaster once you made a decision. So a postmortem is, what the Trump administration is doing right now after dismissing Comey. why did it go wrong and what happened there? Why did that turn into such a disastrous thing? So that's a post-mortem. Why did the situation go wrong? Or it's what the Hillary Clinton campaign has been doing for quite a while. Why did that go wrong? What happened there? Why did we lose? A pre-mortem is looking in advance. What can go wrong and how do we fix it in advance? So this is a very strategic approach, which involves 6 steps. That is one of the tip sheets that I have is about the pre-mortem. So one is about decision making, and one is about the pre-mortem. So the first step is going to be gathering stakeholders in the meeting. And you want to ensure a mix of people with expertise on the topic and ability to make decisions. So for example, I was doing a consulting project for a software company in San Francisco, about 1,300 employees, which were moving to a different performance management system to basically change their evaluation from hour billed per client to a peer review system, to team-based peer review. So we gathered together the HR, the VP of the HR VP, the CFO, then the executive director, of course, 2 higher level managers, and also I encouraged strongly, based on my encouragement, 2 representatives from ordinary people, programmers. So one representative of the typical white males in the company, and one person who was an Indian woman from the diversity committee, who was in the diversity committee there. So gather them all in the room, and you want, again, both expertise and authority. Then explaining all the steps. Now, a pre-mortem involves getting everyone to describe anonymously why the situation may fail. You ask all to imagine a future where the project definitively failed. Absolutely, no question, totally failed. And then ask each participant to write possible reasons for failure anonymously, especially reasons that might be seen as rude or unpopular. And then you want a facilitator, ideally independent, brought in from outside, to gather written comment and read them aloud. That way you don't know who said anything, you don't know anyone's signature, the person can facilitate that conversation. And so in this case, the CEO was pushing back on the anonymous kind of evaluation. I had to explain to the CEO that she would not get responses that were as honest if it wasn't anonymous. So there would be things like groupthink, which is another bias, where people defer to the expertise of the top leader, or what's known as shoot the messenger or the mom effect. And that's another cognitive bias where people are not willing to tell you the honest truth because they know that negative information will be associated with them, and they don't pass up the information up the organizational hierarchy. So both of those are things that are really harmful in group decision making, which is why anonymous decisions on a pre-mortem are really helpful. So we gathered a number of reasons, and then we discussed all the reasons that were brought up, paying particular attention to those that seem rude and unpopular or dangerous to careers. In this case, there were 2 major ones that fell within that category. One was that the top level management didn't have enough support for this project, for this process, and so it would fail because of that. Another one was that it would fail because it would evaluate unfairly the people who were not the dominant white males in the company. So those were the 2 reasons that were brought up that were rude, unpopular, dangerous to careers. And then we evaluated the probabilities. So percentage probabilities for each one, again, anonymously by each person independently, and then averaged them out. So the first reason, the probability of failure because of that was around 40%. The second one was 60%. Then you talk about what to do with them. Decide on several failures that are most relevant, so in this case, those 2, and brainstorm ways of preventing these failures from occurring. And so in this case, the first was relatively straightforward. Because the people with authority were in the room, we made a decision that the project would take place at least 12 months after the project was implemented. That it wouldn't be, so the top level leadership support, they would give it at least 12 months until evaluating the outcome of this process, performance management change. The second was harder because it involved diversity issues and was touchy from an HR perspective. So we decided on a couple of things. First, we talked about highlighting this problematic issue to all teams prior to them doing their evaluations, kind of the potential for bias in the evaluation process with the diversity issues. And second, we gave the diversity committee a charge of evaluating whether minorities are getting systematically lower scores and then raising artificially the scores of minorities by the average of how much lower they're getting the scores. So those two areas those were addressing the minority diversity issue. And after 12 months, they implemented everything. After 12 months, it went fine. There were some issues with diversity, and they averaged out the scores to raise them, but it led to a healthy conversation about diversity issues within the company. So that was actually had the silver lining of having that. And their productivity improved by about 23% as a result of that change. So that they were all the outcome was quite good overall for that company.
Gleb, how long did the pre-mortem process take?
Oh, the pre-mortem process,
What you led them through this?
it's about, it's a minimum an hour, but usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours. But an hour is sufficient if there's not more time.
So they gave their kind of worst case scenario feedback, and then someone who is not part of the group?
Yeah, an independent facilitator gathered them, and then we chose several things to focus on. In this case, 2, because those were the most problematic, and we decided those were the things worth discussing, and then brainstorm ways of solving them. And one of the tip sheets, like I said, is specifically describing the pre-mortem process. So now I know we're going to run until 7:30, so we have a little bit of time. I'd like you to turn to the person with whom you previously partnered and discuss a situation, the decision that you previously wrote down that you were thinking about, and how you would solve that for a pre-mortem process. And so take a couple of minutes each to discuss that and what kind of problems you anticipate with it and how it can be resolved.
The decision we're not to make?
I don't think we did that yet. I don't think we wrote down our
Oh,
decision.
that's something I forgot to ask you to do. Okay, so a decision that, my mistake. A decision that you are thinking about or that a client might be making that you want to process with somebody and get some help on. So 2 minutes each, okay? I'm going to be going around and seeing if anybody needs help. Just flag me down if you do.
So this is
One, understanding more about their concerns and their issues, but then senior first, and now
They already have some answers. And more in a reality based on reality.
Sit in some groups and see what's going on. So ignore me.
Sure. So I'm actually trying to see what we're supposed to be doing.
So try to figure out your decision very quickly with a gut intuitive pre-mortem process. What can go wrong, and get advice from the other person on how to address it.
Yes, what do you think you're on? Yeah, good.
Put that in disaster.
Yeah, I do that too.
See, yours is really very similar to ours because we were in the midst of putting together our PTO
Brainstorm
for the years
Together.
operations.
So we're mentioning about irregularities.
But we don't have any developed. And so it's kind of like, how do we determine what's the
People always take some because they do. I've been there, done that already. I don't want to do it again. It's part-time, but it's going classes. But it is, it's counseling, so it's pretty
And
intense.
so we're just kind of,
But we're also in the process.
exactly. Exactly. I just went through KPIs with
You should finish up in 30 seconds and let the other person take a turn. So 30 seconds, let the other person take a turn.
Let's imagine we did this.
I was looking back at it, I was talking with my and so then we had another discussion on that. So now I've been challenged to go back to the
All right, you should really switch to the other person. So let the other person take a turn describing their problem and how to solve it.
So that would be like a way to be like, we decided this. Let's just make
you're done. And we're coming up on when we were talking through it, no one's going to be able to achieve this. So we set them up for failure. And we want to be good partners. We want them to be good partners. Exactly.
The question that I raised to them as
And so, we're re-looking at it. I don't know where we're going to land. That's one of my projects that I've been.
All right, folks. All right, let's finish up. These are great conversations which you can continue after the presentation. You can exchange your contact information and continue that information.
I like that.
Yes. So exchange contact information with the other person and continue these conversations afterward.
This is a good sign, actually. Well,
I know it's a good sign. I don't mind.
but I mean, I just.
Folks, hey. All right, this is really good. I know that. This is a good sign. I like that. See, this is the promise of the premortem. Yeah, I agree, Richard. Yes, that's really important. Great sign. No, I'm really glad that you find these conversations really helpful, and this illustrates the power of the premortem process. I want to hear a little bit about,
She owes me $10. It really helped.
So what was your experience, if you want to share?
Between what I was seeing on the screen and what we actually ended up doing.
Okay.
That's the whole big long.
Yeah, that's the whole big, I was just wanted.
It was, when you brought it up, when you introduced activities, so my focus went to there, and I was using that initially as a source for guidance. It wasn't until you sort of became able to help this out. So I don't know why I'm telling you that, but it happened.
Okay,
So
that's good for me to know. I'll try to cut this part down
you
to.
don't have to cut that down, that's beautiful, but it didn't connect with that, with the exercise.
Fair enough.
So I finally got onto it, and I just
Okay, good. So I'll keep in mind to provide some more guidance in the future for that. But how did the exercise itself go?
It's nice to have a reflecting pool, because I'm kind of steeped in my own biases or my own experience, and so to hear some of my points of view reflected back to me, kind of gathered them, and then was able to provide some feedback. So it's nice to kind of get out of my head and hear a separate
Mhm.
That's more neutral.
Mhm.
You got it right ahead.
I was gonna say, wasn't really.
I said move back here.
Like
You said to
20
move
years
back to
ago.
Ohio.
Oh, there you go.
It's a great idea to move from Hawaii. I think.
Yes. Anyone else wants to share?
I like this process because sometimes when we think about what could go wrong,
Mhm.
I often see in meetings, oh, you're a naysayer, right?
Mhm.
And I could even see myself, because sometimes because of my expertise in something, and we had this experience with Julie, and I was like, oh my gosh, Julie, I hope I didn't offend you, because she was bringing this amazing idea, which I love, but my first reaction was like, oh my gosh, have we considered all of this? Which doesn't matter. I
Mhm.
wasn't saying that it wasn't going to work, right?
Yeah.
But this just really lets people get everything out.
Yep.
And then you can decide, okay, what's really valid, what's really not. So it's almost like a way to get your fears out, get the concerns out without feeling like you're shifting a conversation one way or another. So it's
Yeah.
a really, really cool way to just, what could go wrong? That's
Yeah.
the reality of life. Things can go wrong.
Mhm.
Sean Aker, what does he say? Instead of rose tinted glasses, rose colored glasses.
Mhm.
So it's like, how do we be positive within the reality?
Yes.
Right? So I think it's great.
Yeah. So.
Have you heard of or are you familiar with the Bono's 6 thinking hats?
Yes, I know.
Because
Yeah.
that gives you that.
Different perspectives.
It gives you that, and you can,
Yeah.
you're intentionally saying, well, let's put on our black hats.
And how would you approach it
It
that
suddenly
way?
allows everybody to actually be supported in coming forward with.
Absolutely.
Well-
Yeah, I love that.
This exercise has a benefit of anonymity, which is really important, and I strongly go in a way that I know about that exercise, and that's definitely helpful, but the anonymity is really crucial in an organizational context, where it will...
Makes sense to me, especially if you want to get at it quickly.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah. So that's going to be really important, having anonymity to get people to actually tell you what they think and what will actually go wrong in a more direct fashion.
Well, we discussed anonymity in our group as well, and I was thinking that another way to approach it, to get information out where we don't necessarily have to be anonymous, is to give people permission to say what could go wrong. I'm not saying you think it would,
Mhm.
but think about others, maybe empathically thinking about the full group and what could go wrong. So just make a list that way.
I hear you. I have been in contexts where people said things in private notes that they wouldn't have said. Like, for example, there was a nonprofit trying to do a fundraiser, and the person who was leading the fundraising committee, it was a member-based nonprofit, and there were apparently
The person from what they said of what could,
yeah, it's really hard to
we
do.
tend to attach still.
Mhm.
And actually that 6 hats thing, that makes it really easy too, kind of what you're saying, because then everybody thinks from that perspective, so then it makes it kind of even, right? It's not
Mhm.
just this person that said that could go wrong, right? We're
Yeah.
all thinking from an actual perspective.
And especially if you have, the software programmer and the CEO in the room, you don't know who said the thing. So that's a big benefit. So I want to encourage all of you to invest in avoiding disasters. Whenever I do these presentations, I ask people to think about investing at least 1% of your resources in improving decision-making, in avoiding disasters for improving decision-making. You'll work from 35 to 40 hours a week. That's about over 150 hours a month. Take an hour and a half per month to improve your decision-making process. Take an hour and a half per month to avoid disasters. Read books about this topic. Go to seminars. Get coaching. Take online classes in avoiding disasters. Spend 1% of your money on avoiding disasters. Let's say if you're making $775,000 a year, invest $750 in avoiding disasters. How much will that save you down the road? An ounce of prevention is worth many pounds of cure. And that 1% will come back to you many-fold, many-fold. I really appreciate you coming to this presentation, and I want you to take 2 minutes right now to fill out the evaluation sheets that were passed around. Thank you for coming, and you can get the PowerPoint here. If you want to get the 2 free tip sheets, please put down on your evaluation sheet on the back, just write tip sheets, and I will send you the 2 tip sheets. So write the tip sheets to get the tip sheet on avoiding disastrous decisions and avoiding disasters once a decision is made.